Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin, executive editor at the Mises Institute. And this week we're going to talk a little bit about modern monetary theory, as it calls itself, and the issue of Chartalism, and what is it that drives people to use fiat money, even though it's quote-unquote unbacked by gold or silver or whatever. We'll talk a little bit about that issue of money and how MMT is wrong about that and how they've invented this made-up version of history where the only reason that people use fiat money is because they have to use it to pay taxes. So we'll get in some of the details of that. And to do that today, we've got Joshua Mawhorter here with us today. Now, Josh is a contributing editor at the Mises Institute, and he's also just a regular working editor in the sense that he's the guy you send your submissions to, and he works with Bill Anderson, our senior editor here at the Mises Institute, just to get all of those articles on Mises.org that you see every day. That's MISES.org. If you haven't been, if you're interested in this sort of thing, I do recommend you go over to Mises.org and click on subscribe. You can also, of course, click on donate if you are so motivated. But subscribing, you can select a daily or weekly email to receive articles and topics like this in your inbox, either every day or every Saturday. Well, let's talk about MMT and all of that sort of stuff and why people use fiat money. Josh, now the term that people are going to come across when they look at this topic and this strange argument is Chartalism. So let's just go ahead and start off with covering sort of the basics. Kind of just tell us what it is, what Chartalism is, and we'll kind of get more into why it's relevant after that.
Sure. Yeah. Well, and thanks for having me. Well, Chartalism is, in short, the state theory of money. Is sometimes how it's put. Basically, it's like a charter, a declaration of the state that makes money money. Now, the definition gets a little bit slippery, and that's kind of where MMT is able to kind of find their dubious historical examples. But pure Chartalism, or Chartalism proper, as I'm probably going to call it from here on out, is the idea that money comes from the state issuing an otherwise worthless fiat token, and I'm not saying worthless as a pejorative, I'm just saying they just make a token that nobody's trading with or anything like that, and they issue it to the community. They have the community, they require that they exchange real resources with the government in exchange for this fiat token, and then the government requires tax payment at the whatever point of the year, and taxes can be paid in that fiat token. Then the theory is that because of those actions of government, that not only do people use the fiat token to pay their taxes, they recognize, hey, this token has the backing of the government behind it. Let's start using it for market exchanges with one another, and therefore it becomes a generally accepted medium of exchange. But if you look in there, there's a leap from, well, even if the government does this, that doesn't lead to necessarily it becoming a generally accepted medium of exchange. But that's where they kind of sneak in that non sequitur. But yeah, so that's pure Chartalism. It's a fairly simple idea.
Now, when you say token, right, like it could be just straight up tax-paying tokens, theoretically.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Like in the old days, I don't know if if younger people know about this. In the old days, you would like go to a video arcade and you would exchange your money for tokens that you could only use on like the attractions and the video games there at the establishment. Right. So it was this medium between just your dollars and the use in that particular place. So theoretically, right, that's what money could be. And I think we could even in some cases define it as that, strictly speaking, as that, oh yeah, it's like a token. Mm-hmm. But it seems that MMT is arguing something much broader than that maybe even they intended it as a token originally, but suddenly everyone decides, oh, this is now the money we're going to use for everything. It's money now. It's not just a token. We were told to use this for taxes, and now we just accept it everywhere. And it seems like MMT accepts that this is worthless unless it were made taxes, that nobody would use this money.
Correct.
That's an argument they make, right?
Yeah, that's where the money demand, or the value of the money, they will say that it's an otherwise worthless or fiat token. That's, that's not putting words in their mouths. They believe that it really can be anything. Like you mentioned, like grew up with Chuck E. Cheese tokens and stuff like that. And people, kind of, or they will use, it's like the scoreboard at a football game. They don't have to go get those points from anywhere. They just create them, right? Or older writers would use this analogy of the coat room, where you put your coat and then you have this paper. Where those don't work is the kids. I don't think the kids at Chuck E. Cheese start exchanging their tokens with each other, at least not outside of Chuck E. Cheese, and same thing with the coat room, exchanging those papers. But yeah, it can be anything, and they believe that what gives money its value is the issuance of the government and the taxing requirement. So that's where, for them, money demand comes from. Whereas for the Austrian school, money demand comes from the fact that money was a commodity good that was, a consumable good like gold, silver, or whatever else. And then it had an added value that it could be used as a medium of exchange, and then maybe something like gold is just used as a medium of exchange. So their whole thing is that the government and its taxing power is what gives money its value.
Now, so why are we even talking about this, right? Like, why is this issue relevant now, and why are now Chartalism and MMT, as you know, aren't exactly the same thing. It's like MMT uses Chartalism to support its overall agenda. So why are we talking about MMT though? Like, they've got this whole historical view. Why do we care? Like, why is it relevant now?
Well, I think in general, history is important, and Rothbard had talked about. I think, I don't know if I could trace down this quote, but he talked about the three social studies that are the most vulnerable to propaganda are economics, law, and history. And so it's not just that history is important. It's important to me, but I'm a lover of American history. It's important because the MMTers use Chartalism as a history of kind of saying, this is really how money always was. And then that opens up new possibilities, that if money is really a creature of the state, as George Friedrich Knapp, who wrote the original state theory of money, kind of developed that Chartalism concept. If money is really the creature of the state, in that the state is the one who originates money and gives its value through taxation, then money is really just a policy tool. And they have this ability to kind of fine-tune the economy through monetary policy. And so they can expand and inflate to rearrange real resources, which is true. But then they believe, well, if price inflation gets too hot, then the government can just tax money out of it. And so through that, they can get the economy to full capacity. And they've heard of inflation, but they don't really realize the distortions those types of actions have on the structure of production. They don't know about the boom-bust cycle. They don't take account of the fact that humans are reactive and at choosing agents. So when you inflate and tax, people change their behavior based on those things. So they kind of treat it and kind of this mechanistic view. And the Republican right really is powerless to critique this, besides just saying, well, this is such a crazy idea to inflate the money out into valuelessness. But they adopt largely monetary policy as well. They think that money is a policy instrument to be wielded by government. So it's important because Chartalism gives them this kind of shield to use history to back up their views. But the kind of funny thing that I've found, and I credit Dr. Jonathan Newman for this note that he had in his paper, where he had a quote from Randall Wray about that they will use Chartalism and they'll talk about how crazy, fantasized, made up, ahistorical this idea of Menger and Mises' theory that money was commodity goods that became generally accepted medium of exchange, and that's how money got its value. They will say all kinds of, that this is just a never land. That's an actual quote, and all these things. And they will say the true history is Chartalism. However, they'll say, I found one writer that said, it was Randall Wray who said that, but it doesn't really matter if Chartalism actually happened in history or not, because we're talking about modern monetary theory. And so they'll use Chartalism to build up their case, and then they throw away the latter as soon as it becomes inconvenient for them. So, but I'm like, I want to hold them to, if you believe Chartalism, then you have to stick by it and see if it's historically the case or not.
Well, and if they're going to say that it explains things in modern times, then we would need them to explain things that are going on right now. And I think we need to soon get into some real actual examples, I think, because a lot of this has been real theoretical,
right, that
we've been talking about. But just I think the main point, as you alluded to a few minutes ago, is why does it become generally used and not just for taxes? And this is covered in an article in the Quarterly Journal of Austrian Economics. Per Bieland has an article on this. It's called, "Is It Money Because It Is Redeemed in Tax Payments?" A response to Kelton and Ray. That is Stephanie Kelton and, of course, Randall Wray, as you just mentioned. And he just says, right, it's like, of course we could understand why people would take enough of the fiat currency to pay taxes, and they'd be able to anticipate about how much they need. But there's nothing in the theory that explains, for whatever time period, that it would explain why people accept much more than the needed amount to pay taxes. And they don't offer an explanation for this. And so if they're saying, oh, well, we're just explaining the way things are now, so historical explanations don't matter, well, this is a current explanation. That's right. Not explained at all. And so why? And of course, I suspect the reason is that, right, it's somehow tied to earlier monies, right? Like Mises talks about with this regression theorem of money and things like that, right? People use money because it's money. This is a point that Per Bieland makes, right? Yeah, people use money as money because it's money, because it was already established as money. So if you come in and you say, well, we're going to use it for we're going to mandate that you use it for taxes, and then suddenly it magically becomes money, can't find any situation, Bieland is saying, where something that wasn't money just magically became money. Because of a foreign edict.
Right.
Because even then, even if the government says this is money now and you're going to use it, people would still use barter in those cases or some sort of foreign money, as we've seen in many cases, right, where the government can say, oh, this is the money you have to use to pay taxes, and people will scrape together enough for that to pay taxes, but they prefer the dollar or they prefer some other money.
Sure.
Sometimes they'll use gold and silver, but that's usually hard to come by in some horrible economy, right, that's been ruined by the state, and those are the states that try and prop up their fiat currency. So there's just this idea that suddenly everyone's just going to start using this money that maybe would seemingly work in the case of something like the dollar. But as you note, history doesn't back that up either. And the reason I had you on is because you wrote a couple of articles last month. One is called MMT in U.S. History, Redefining Chartalism. And then there was a follow-up, or that was the follow-up to an earlier article called MMT, Chartalism and the Colonial Experience. So I think rather than continuing to talk theoretically about this stuff, maybe you could provide us with some historical examples that call into question the theory, and especially from American history. So I think that could be particularly helpful.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And let me say a couple of things. That article from Dr. Beeland is excellent, and it's a response to a Twitter back and forth with him and Stephanie Kelton. And she says, okay, well, read this paper and respond to it, and then, I'll get back to you. So he wrote a whole paper walking through in a very just sound and consistent way the problems. And not that, people have lives and jobs and things that they got to do, but he tried to put it back out there, and she kind of said, I don't have time to deal with this now. Which is like, okay, but you said that this was the thing, the clenching argument, and it just really wasn't compelling. And he makes another, his is great to read alongside the articles that I've written, but his is also makes the point that even when the state did intervene and create paper monies and people accepted and traded in them, why did they do that? Well, they did that because they believed that either in the future, in the present or near future, and then in the distant future, that they could exchange that paper for money, that it was redeemable in silver and gold. And also they had the advantage, well, if this is money and people have to accept it because of legal tender laws and compulsory par laws, where the government said, here's paper money, we'll redeem it in the future for silver and gold. By the way, people have to accept this in contracts and payment of debts, which is what legal tender laws do. Of course, people would rather pay that for debts than and taxes than give up their gold and silver. That's just good old Gresham's law, where the bad money drives out the good money, and the good people would rather give up the paper fiat rather than the actual money. But yeah, I think it's important to look at historical examples of this, because when MMT talks about their theory, they will readily admit that not every country can do MMT. So they'll say, well, this doesn't count for like Venezuela and Greece and these countries. But there are some countries that are monetarily sovereign, meaning they don't have debt denominated in foreign currencies. So countries like the United States, Canada, the UK, Japan, that these countries are the few countries that can possibly implement MMT. And their favorite example is the United States. Okay, so if that's their favorite example, then we should be able to look into the fairly recent history of U.S. money. And, the U.S. is not that old, like 400 years old relative to other countries. It's not like, sometimes they'll try to go all the way back to ancient Mesopotamia and make claims, about, 5,000 years ago, this is what was going on, which isn't accurate either. But the U.S., we have written documentation, we have, very developed history, and and our history is not that old. And it doesn't show Chartalism. So my thing has been, if your best example of MMT is missing a key component, then you have to either give up Chartalism, which they try to do sometimes, or you have to say that it doesn't work it doesn't qualify as a monetary sovereign, so they don't get to have it both ways. But as far as examples, the first example, which Rothbard talks about in I don't remember what book, but it's quoted in the article. I think it's Monetary History of the United States. But he refers to the first time that fiat paper money is really created, and that's in Massachusetts in 1690. And so in colonial Massachusetts, you have this regular raid that they would go up and they'd fight against the colonies in Quebec, and then they were hoping to get enough loot to come back, pay their soldiers, and etc. They failed to do that, and so now you have these unpaid soldiers who are not happy with this situation, which is kind of dangerous for the government. So the government, for the first time, not through the banking industry or anything, they print up paper money. Okay. Now they give them this paper money with the promise, and this is key, that the paper money will be, there will be no more paper money printed. Promise number one. And promise number two, we will redeem this paper money at par for gold and silver at some not too distant future date. Well, as you can imagine, just knowing how governments work, both of those promises got abandoned. They immediately realized once they could print money, they printed up more money. And it was like, I don't remember, it was, I think, multiple decades before the money was eventually redeemable in gold or silver. Now, the MMTers would look at that and feel triumphant to say, see, we told you. The government created paper money, intervened through its interventions and its acceptance of the colonial paper money as tax payments. It made money. It made a generally accepted medium of exchange. The disanalogy with that example is that there were already on the market existing currencies that were already money. The markets had already created money exactly in the way that Menger describes, that generally accepted media of exchange had come from goods that people recognized as consumable goods, but then also had the features of being money, and then they realized they could use them for indirect exchange. So the further disanalogy is, well, why did people start accepting this fiat money? Well, they didn't believe it was fiat money, to be technical. They believed it was a genuine money substitute, as Mises called it, where fiat money is just totally printed out. It has no backing in anything. The people of colonial Massachusetts believed that the money was or would be redeemable in gold or silver. And Rothbard says, had they not believed that key piece that they could exchange this at some point for real money, people would not have accepted it. So the reason why governments can create fiat money is because they have to give it some sort of connection, even if it's not literally true. They have to try to make the people think that there's some sort of connection between their paper and real money. So chartalists try to do this, MMTers try to do this slippery thing where, as I defined chartalism at the beginning, government creates a worthless fiat token, forces the people to exchange real resources with it, and then accepts tax payment in that, and it becomes a general medium of exchange for that. You don't have any of those things in the colonial Massachusetts case. What you have is money already existed, and the state intervened, and people believed that the money was connected and redeemable in true money, or money proper, as Mises called it. So you have to watch out, because they do this slippery thing where they'll define chartalism proper, and then they will look at monetary interventions like legal tender laws and printing of money and see that that proves our case, when it actually is evidence against their case. So that's just one example. There's a lot more we can look at, but
I mean, is there another one that you think is particularly fruitful that we would look at in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other article that I wrote on was on tobacco. Was that we had, I called it the tobacco standard, playing off of the gold standard, and the early, colonial Virginia, was able to start not only growing tobacco, exchanging it, had a high market demand in the colonies and worldwide at that time. And then they realized that, you know what, tobacco can really serve as money. And they even printed warehouse receipts that traded of money, but it was 100% backed by tobacco, and other colonies used tobacco as money. But yeah, there's so many examples where not only tobacco but several commodities were used as generally accepted media of exchange. So you had rice, nails, wampum beads, all sorts of things that, I have some quotes from Edward Griffin, who wrote his book on the creature from Jekyll Island, but he has a lot of monetary history on there as well, and Rothbard and others who talk about how many things served as money that came totally organically. Now, the governments may have come about after the fact and said, we're going to define a weight or a measure, or we're going to define legal tender, whatever the case. And I'll be fair enough to say, I still am looking into, does the government's stamp of approval help those things? But there are cases where the government comes in and says, we're going to define what an ounce of tobacco is relative to an ounce of gold, and we're going to lock in those things. Well, the problems with that is that supply and demand changes the prices of those things. So once you do that, you run into Gresham's law again. But the other thing that I discovered, and I honestly, I know everybody's kind of biased in their own case, but I honestly was looking into this thing, okay, can I find any example of Chartalism in American history? And one of the things that I came across in a really interesting encyclopedia, it referenced a work from the 1700s that just made the point of defining how the word currency was used. And the word currency back then in English in the colonies, it's not like we think of today when if I go out on the street and I say, hey, what do you think of currency? Well, they would say the dollar, money. But back then, currency was whatever goods were trading currently as media of exchange. So people kind of take this anachronistic view of currency means the dollar, paper money, and they backwards read that into history, where this author was careful to distinguish, no, currency was what was trading on the market as money that had nothing to do with the government. And so even just the definition of how that word was used shows that money was not a product of state action. It was a product of the spontaneous order of markets. That really undermines their case. And there was one other quote. There was an anonymous author, a guy who had written under a pseudonym for a New Jersey newspaper, and his views were a little bit too friendly, I think, toward the government. But in that case, the government wasn't intervening that much in money. But he wrote, and this is the MMT and U.S. History Redefining Chartalism article that I end with. I'll just summarize it, but he basically talks about how, well, why do we accept this paper money that the government has given us? And he says that's for one reason, that he says the government is acting in such a trustworthy way that we have confidence that we can take this paper money at any time with no questions asked, exchange it, and get silver and gold. And because of that fact, we have confidence in trading in the paper money. Absent that, there's no reason for them to be confident in the paper money. So he makes the connection that while we trade in the government's paper, it's only because we have confidence that the government is not inflating and that we can exchange it at any time for real money. So the money in that way was acting as a warehouse receipt, as money should, but that's obviously the governments broke that trust over time. It's too tempting to have the option to print money and then have people, have to accept it by legal tender laws. So yeah, those are some examples, but there's many more. So U.S. history should be a nightmare for MMT.
Well, let's look at more recent examples, right? I mean, the transition from the classical gold standard to fiat currencies, right? And you'll notice it's always very gradual. It would seem that if you're going to make the Chartalist argument, you would have to show some sort of clean break where we're not using the gold and silver anymore. We're just using this paper money that we're inventing. But I can't find any cases of that. And if we look at what happened, right, with because that's not what happened when they switched over from the classical gold standard to paper money in the West, right? There were many steps, right? So first of all, there were, as we've had in many articles here, and I wrote a series of articles recently on like the older history of money, right? How money in, say, France and England before, say, the 17th century, there were just coins. Right, coins were circulating, and the coins were silver or gold, and they all had different value. And the Bank of Amsterdam started standardizing that stuff to some extent. They were providing a service where, okay, this is a reliable bank where we know that this coin from this bank is a certain amount of gold just because they have a good reputation and all of that stuff. And you had all of this stuff, different stuff circulating all the time. There were thousands at one point. Maybe hundreds, at least 600 different types of coins circulating in France, say in like the late Middle Ages and the early modern period and stuff, right? And even though there was to some extent like the king's approved money that he let nobles create and stamp out and all of that stuff, everybody was using all sorts of other stuff. Well, eventually they had this brain storm that, okay, we're just going to start defining amounts of gold and silver as the franc or as the pound or as the German dollar, spelled with a TH, right? We're going to define it as these things. And it was still gold and silver, but it was defined as a certain amount with this national name. We've slapped a new name on that's specific to our country. That seemed to be like the first step of separating silver and gold from just being silver and gold. Now it's not silver and gold, it's an amount of silver and gold equal to a pound, equal to a dollar, et cetera, et cetera. And then you had what? You had the Council of Genoa, the Convention of Genoa after World War I, and this was like created the gold exchange standard. So we don't want regular people trading in gold and silver coins anymore, but it's all exchangeable through your bank. And that kind of got people in the habit of not really demanding that they have access to gold and silver all the time. But as you say, they still assumed it was backable in that. And then after World War I, right, also after World War I for a period, shortly after World War I, before they came back and said, oh, we have the gold exchange standard now, there's actually a period, and also during the Napoleonic Wars, where they straight up suspended convertibility, right? But the assumption, again, was always that it was going to go back to being directly convertible into gold and silver. And so then after the war, after Genoa, they go on this gold exchange standard, and then they're like, well, we're not really bringing it back. So there was deception there. It was, we're not bringing it back, but you're already using the pounds. You're already using whatever the national currency is. Just keep using it, guys. And then the dollar finally goes off the gold standard in 1933, 34. But even then, they're still using gold for Bretton Woods. So it's all this step by step, which it always involved these conditioning people to get to use this money with they're always kind of holding out this promise that maybe we'll go back to that too, until maybe 20 years goes by and they're like, let's face it, guys, we're not going back. So there was constantly this effort to just kind of get people out of the habit, to trick them, and all very gradual. So, I mean, when I look at that, right, I just don't see how that has anything to do with this idea of, oh, we just decided now you're using the dollar to pay taxes. That's why you use dollars. People were already using dollars before the income tax came in. They were already using various currencies before taxes came in. And it's not like they all... So I can't find a time period where they said, yeah, the dollar is now a fiat currency that we've created out of nothing, and you're going to use that for taxes. By the time they were telling people to use fiat dollars to pay taxes, they'd already were several steps into this long, gradual process of getting people to convert over. People had already just accepted using paper money and really had kind of put out of their mind the idea of day-to-day convertibility. So it just seems that the process in no way matches up to this idea of, one day we declared fiat money is used for tax, so then everybody switches over. I don't know how they could even invent this idea, but that seems to be something where, people would still use dollars if you didn't have to pay it for taxes today.
Yes. Yeah,
So,
and that's an excellent point. And that was actually when I was studying the regression theorem for really the first time, kind of getting my arms around it in the former Mises graduate program in monetary history that I took with Dr. Murphy. I was reading Menger, and I was I was a little bit skeptical about what he was saying, because his criticism against he criticizes the state theory of money, and he criticizes what he calls the compact theory of money. He criticizes the state theory of money, meaning that there is some declaration of the government that today this is money, which is exactly what you were saying, that didn't happen so far as we can document from history. Then he also criticizes the compact theory of money, that everybody all of a sudden just agreed, in this social compact, this moment where a large majority, at least, of people in society and even worldwide just agreed that this shall be money, from here on out. Well, that didn't happen historically either. So my thing that I pointed back at Menger for a while, but I think was incorrect or incomplete, was I'm like, well, when I look at the regression theorem, there's no historical documentation of that either. But Christopher Hansen has done a great article dealing with this, because that was a criticism that Gary North had made too. I'm like, okay, that's kind of interesting. If Menger's saying there's no proof of this in history, his case doesn't seem to have definitive proof in history either. So I'm trying to think through this, but then I realized, well, something that's that big of a deal would, like the government all of a sudden declaring, from here on out, this piece of paper is your money, you will accept it, here's how it's going to work. Especially in American history, that's much more likely to have been significant enough to be documented. So same thing if there was this, colonial-wide, or whatever compact of where people agreed that this thing shall be money. That would have been, something noteworthy in history. But the regular little exchanges of barter exchange, to where people start making decisions and exchanges even in their own head of, well, I'm going to trade this bit of tobacco not to get, or I'm going to accept this thing for tobacco, but I'm actually going to use the tobacco not to keep, but to buy something else. Nobody can document those mundane little exchanges in history. The point of Menger and Mises was just that it was, it made economic theoretical sense, even if you couldn't go back through history and document that. Nobody would have thought, today we decided, I'm going to use this for that. Maybe we'll find that history someday. So that was some skepticism that I had initially about the Menger Mises idea of where money came from, but I came around to kind of see, okay, well, that kind of makes sense why that wouldn't be documented in history. But you're right, they absolutely have no claim to history whatsoever. Dr. Jonathan Newman has done a chapter contribution and written some articles on their claims to ancient Mesopotamia, where they try to go back and say, well, look, the priestly class was requiring taxes in this and then requiring you to use their token of silver and gold. That's how silver became money. But people were already exchanging in silver and gold. And even if you read in ancient texts and things like in the Old Testament or the New Testament, the amounts of money that's being exchanged are measurements. They're measurements of that thing, silver or gold, that's accepted on the market. So even when you go back to ancient Mesopotamia, Um, they the historical cases don't work even if you just do a little bit of research. So that's what's so I think I'm trying to use the right word, somewhere between annoying and infuriating, that MMTers are so bold in what they say about barter. They Randall Ray calls it a never never land. That he says that I'll read a quote. He says there is no evidence of a barter based economy of trading like this, and all evidence about the origins of money points to state involvement. They call it literally, though, these are their words, fantasized, made up story, and just made up world that never existed, which is fine. Hey, if I'm fine with sharp criticism, but you've got to be able to back it up. They say all evidence points to Chartalism, and then Ray will say, well, but Chartalism doesn't. Even if you did prove it wrong, it doesn't really matter. So it's like they still write either way. But what was the other thing that was annoying was I found, this guy that they all refer to, that they all say, you've got to read Mitchell Innes's 1913, it's not a book, it's more of an essay called What is Money? And so I'm like, okay, well, if this is the must-read thing, I'm going to go look that up and see what he says about, tobacco, see what he said. And, it's a not super long thing. He writes this thing and he talks about, he talks about how even as regards various colonial laws that made corn, tobacco receivable in payment of debts, he says these commodities were never a medium of exchange in the economic sense of a commodity. Well, they absolutely were. Like, that's provable from history. But the icing on the cake was that Innes's What is Money, written in 1913, had a 1914 review from John Maynard Keynes. And so I say, okay, well, now I've got to read this. And he goes in and says of Innes's work that he's weaker on theory, but stronger on history. Okay, no problem. Like, some people are historians, not, economic theoreticians. That would be fine if that were true. But then Keynes says himself that when it comes to history, which is Innes's strong point, he says, Mr. Innes endeavors to establish by an historical inquiry the value of which, unfortunately, is much diminished by the entire absence of any reference to authorities. So he says he's not so great on theory, but better on history. And by the way, when it comes to history, he doesn't have any references to any historical data or information. And then, if that wasn't enough, I couldn't believe what I was reading. I had to reread this sentence. I'm putting it in ChatGPT and saying, am I really reading this correctly? And I'm an editor for the Mises Institute. My whole job is supposed to be, pretty careful reading. I'm like, am I being punked? Am I reading this correctly? Because this is just, at the end of his article, his review, Keynes says, it's difficult to check his assertions to be certain whether or not they contain some element of exaggeration. But the main historical conclusions, which he seeks to drive home, I think have much foundation. So he talks about he's not so good on theory, better on history, but he doesn't cite any historical sources. But I think his statements about history have much foundation. And then Keynes says the reason why he believes that is because he has ideological sympathy with him. He says that Mr. Innes has gone some way toward showing that a history of basically the gold standard and barter-based money is mythical. So it's just so you can kind of see that any opportunity to show that Keynes was not a good economist, was an ideologue.
Well, certainly a terrible historian too. I mean,
Yeah, absolutely.
His Rako covers a lot of Keynes's embarrassing work when it comes to information about the Soviet Union. in Keynes's time. The excuses he made for Soviet totalitarianism is really quite remarkable. And why did he make those excuses? Because he had a certain ideological affinity for the Soviets, which we're now supposed to believe he was some sort of liberal or something. Right. But I mean, Keynes was, of course, he along with the Webbs, he was a huge fan of the Soviets and praised them for their willingness to experiment. He said, what were the outcomes of those experiments? Mass murder, but that didn't seem to bother Keynes very much. So why would he care about this more academic issue then? Right. He's writing history, but he has neither primary sources nor secondary sources. But that seems fine. That seems to be Keynes.
But he makes some really great points. Even if he did, how would we know? That's what. Because I even as myself, like looking at this stuff, it's like I have my certain political views too. I'm a libertarian. I don't, they like the MMTers like the state and we don't. Okay, that's the truth of the matter. So I'm like trying to say, okay, I need to check my premises. Am I really being a good historian? Am I being honest with what I'm trying to find? And then I read something like this, and I'm like, okay, that is totally blatant as far as just academically irresponsible. But yeah, as you said, when you're willing to say, hey, at least some elites in the Soviet Union are bold with their experiments. Doesn't matter if it results in the deaths of millions of people. Why would he care about, hey, this guy wrote some great history on money. He doesn't have any sources, but at least it gets us away from this stupid gold standard idea.
Well, maybe that explains their MMT's popularity in social media and such, is the way you get traction in social media is to say incorrect things with the utmost confidence and bluster. I mean, it works, because how could anyone say this with so much confidence if it wasn't true? But apparently, you just go, well, I mean, Machiavelli would be proud, I guess, right. Would be happy. I mean, this using Machiavelli's methods to get ahead in social media. Maybe there's something to that. Well, we better go ahead and wrap up this episode of Radio Rothbard. Thank you, Josh, for joining us. So this is a very specific topic, but I think it's an important one because there's just so much error being spouted out there about the origins and nature of money, and then they use that to support terrible monetary policy. And I think that's what we're seeing at work now with MMT. So I'm sure we'll be back for more for this topic in the future as monetary policy fails to save us from our ongoing inflationary and stagnation problems. But thank you everyone out there for listening. Again, you can get more on these topics. You can see the articles we mentioned here at mises.org, Mises.org. We'll be back next week with more, so we'll see you next time.